31-year-old Florida resident Sammy McKnight was apprehended and detained in June of 2022 on suspicion of murder. He'd been sought in connection to the killing of a man in Volusia County. When he'd met McKnight, the victim, 36-year-old James Shirley, was reportedly living in his car. The former had befriended him and they were captured by surveillance cameras speaking outside of a Circle K for about 90 minutes while sharing soda and cigarettes. An argument eventually broke out that devolved into a physical altercation, during the course of which McKnight brandished a handgun and fired 7 shots at Shirley, 5 of which struck him. Footage showed the gunman then grabbing the victim's backpack, getting into the victim's vehicle and fleeing the scene. In the shooting's wake, Shirley walked for about a block before collapsing inside an IHOP restaurant. Law enforcement received a tip and they were able to capture McKnight. They found him in a neighborhood in Daytona Beach and took him into custody after a brief foot pursuit. During his questioning by investigators and throughout the subsequent court hearings, McKnight didn't offer much information to contextualize the shooting. A judge ordered that he be held without bond. Sheriff Mike Chitwood of Volusia County reported that deputies had discovered a bus ticket inside Shirley's car that was found abandoned in Daytona Beach. A license plate reader had reportedly noticed the vehicle near Nova Road and US Route 92. McKnight's fingerprints were allegedly on the bus ticket. In the past, the man had completed a 6-year sentence in a state prison on charges of theft and burglary. After his release, he was taken into custody in Brevard County on various drug and DUI charges. In July of 2022, McKnight was indicted for Shirley's fatal shooting and the other crimes stemming from the incident. He was charged with first-degree murder, carjacking with a firearm, burglary while armed with a firearm, and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. Number 7. Sabina Erickson. The case of twin sisters Sabina and Ursula Erickson attracted global attention after a 2008 incident in which they experienced an episode of folie à deux, or shared psychosis, a psychiatric disorder in which delusional beliefs are transmitted from one person to another. In May of 2008, the Swedish women boarded a bus bound for London in Liverpool. They suddenly got off the vehicle at a motorway service station near Kiel after displaying erratic behavior. The Erickson sisters, at the time in their early 40s, seemed paranoid and clung to their bags, refusing to let a bus driver check them for illegal items. A crew filming a documentary nearby captured the pair as they ran across the busy highway and into oncoming traffic. Both were struck by vehicles. Ursula's legs were crushed by a lorry, while Sabina spent 15 minutes unconscious after she was struck head-on by a Volkswagen Polo. Both violently resisted the police officers and paramedics who tried to help them. Ursula told law enforcement, "I recognize you and know you're not real," while Sabina, upon regaining consciousness, shouted, "They're going to steal your organs." Both survived and received treatment in the aftermath. Sabina pleaded guilty to the charges of trespass on the motorway and hitting a police officer. She was released on May the 19th without undergoing a full psychiatric evaluation. As she wandered the streets of Stoke-on-Trent looking for her sister, she met and befriended 54-year-old Glenn Hollinshead as he was walking his dog. The man decided to help her and they went back to his home on Duke Street, accompanied by Hollinshead's friend, Peter Malloy. The latter assumed that Sabina had run away from an abusive partner as she seemed paranoid, constantly looking out the window. She would reportedly offer the men cigarettes but then take them back, fearing they were poisoned. Malloy eventually left and Sabina spent the night in Hollinshead's home. The following evening, while the man was preparing a meal, Sabina stabbed him 5 times with a kitchen knife. Hollinshead staggered outside and told a neighbor, "She stabbed me," before collapsing and quickly succumbing to his injuries. As the neighbor called the police, Sabina was captured on surveillance cameras running away from the home with a hammer that she used to sporadically hit herself in the head. She was eventually spotted and chased down by paramedics. The pursuit ended with Sabina jumping onto the A50 from a 40-foot bridge. She survived the fall with broken ankles and a fractured skull. On September the 2nd of 2009, she pleaded guilty to manslaughter with diminished responsibility. The prosecution and defense accepted that she was insane at the time of killing Hollinshead and that she'd regained her sanity in the aftermath. She was determined to have been the secondary sufferer of folie à deux, while Ursula, who since had been released from care and had returned to Sweden, was the primary sufferer. Sabina was given a prison sentence of 5 years. Number 6. Daniel Reese. 23-year-old Rachel Johnson's badly burnt body was found on March the 30th of 1991 by law enforcement in Akron, Ohio. Prior to her remains being set on fire, she'd been abused and stabbed multiple times. A DNA profile was preserved, but the case went cold and the identity of her killer remained unknown for nearly 3 decades. At the time of her death, Johnson had a 3-year-old daughter named Caitlin. In 2019, a genetic testing company in Texas began to work the case of Johnson's brutal murder. Their findings eventually led investigators to Daniel Reese, a man in his late 50s. In the spring of 2020, he was arrested and charged with aggravated murder. 31-year-old Caitlin described the reveal as insane, as the man had been hiding in plain sight, living across the street from her and befriending her family. Caitlin remembered that Reese, whom she hadn't seen since 2007, seemed harmless, and she had many childhood memories involving him. He would reportedly come to gatherings at her home and had even taken her on her first motorcycle ride. The woman told a media outlet, "It's literally insane that this dude lived across the street and had the nerve to be a part of our lives." Number 5. Lois Rice. On March the 23rd of 2018, Minnesota law enforcement were asked to perform a welfare check at the home of 54-year-old David Rice. After he'd failed to contact his work, friends and family for several weeks, law enforcement arrived to find the man fatally shot inside his home. Investigators started searching for his wife, Lois, whom they discovered had withdrawn $11,000 from David's bank account before disappearing. She would remain on the run for nearly a month. Lois fled to Fort Myers Beach, Florida, where she met and befriended 59-year-old Pamela Hutchinson. On the 9th of April, the latter was found dead at a local hotel, fatally shot with the same gun that had been used to murder David Rice. Her bank cards, car keys, and ID were all missing. Investigators determined that Lois had first killed her husband and then targeted Hutchinson, with the purpose of stealing her identity because of their similar appearance. After a 10-day nationwide manhunt, U.S. Marshals found Lois and took her into custody from a bar in South Padre Island, Texas. She was charged with several counts related to murder, theft, and criminal use of personal information of a deceased individual. The Grandma Killer, as the woman came to be known, pleaded guilty to murdering Hutchinson in 2019 and was sentenced to life without parole. She was then extradited to Minnesota, where she pleaded guilty to killing David the following year. Lois admitted to have shot him during a fight and apologized to her family before being handed her second life sentence without the possibility of parole. Number 4. Kirill Volsky. In August of 2018, Russian teenager Kirill Volsky from Khabarovsk told his mother that he was going to spend some time with a school friend and his grandmother. Volsky instead used his savings and flew 3,900 miles to the capital to meet teenager Kristina Kamraeva, with whom he'd talked online on an anime social media group. Upon meeting her in person, Volsky, who'd rented an apartment in the city, claimed that he was in Moscow with his mother to attend the wedding of a family friend. He and Kamraeva met a few times, but he reportedly became angry and jealous that she would also go out with her other friends. He at one point reportedly told Kamraeva that he wanted them to get married and would have children after he would have finished his military service. Kamraeva turned him down. Enraged by the rejection, Volsky stabbed her to death at his rented apartment. He then dismembered the teen and disposed of her remains in drains and trash bins. An extensive search was launched for Kamraeva, who was reported missing after she was last seen on August the 26th. In the weeks that followed after Volsky had returned home, he was questioned by Moscow police via phone and denied having any knowledge about Kamraeva's disappearance. When he stopped answering calls from law enforcement, detectives flew to him from the capital. They put the teen through a lie detector test, and during that process, he confessed to the murder. He told the police where he disposed of the body parts, but because roughly 2 months had passed since the killing, no remains were found. Number 3. Shahin Darvish Naranbon. 34-year-old Shahin Darvish Naranbon, an Iranian national, was detained indefinitely at a secure hospital in England following the murder of senior citizen Brenda Blaney in Thornton-le-Dale, North Yorkshire in January of 2022. Rodney Jameson, the judge assigned to the case, described the killing as occurring under circumstances of appalling brutality. Darvish Naranbon was born in Tehran and had mostly lived in the UK since the age of 15. Though he did spend time in the US, where he was reportedly admitted to a psychiatric unit. He applied for asylum in the UK in 2013 after his visa expired. His claim, however, was denied, and all subsequent appeals were unsuccessful. Between 2017 and 2020, the government was unable to deport Darvish Naranbon because No return agreement with Iran was in place. It wasn't clear whether that aspect had enabled him to stay in the UK despite his previous asylum claims being denied. He'd met Blaney in 2013 in a Leeds restaurant where he worked as a waiter. He was later welcomed into her home in Thornton-le-Dale while he was studying for his master's, and by all accounts, Blaney treated him like her grandson. On January the 2nd of 2022, the 87-year-old was on the phone at her home while placing a grocery order without warning or provocation. Darvish Naranbon charged her with a kitchen knife. Blaney was frail and suffering from the early stages of dementia. Darvish Naranbon took her down and slammed her head against the kitchen floor before slashing her throat and plunging the blade deep into her chest. Several forensic psychiatrists examined Darvish Naranbon following his arrest, and they agreed he was experiencing a psychotic episode most likely related to schizophrenia at the time of the killing. The court deemed that the defendant posed a serious risk to the public and was capable of committing homicidal violence while in psychosis. Prosecutors revealed during court proceedings that he and the victim had had a close relationship and that they'd kept in touch while he was away at university, with Blaney even attending his master's degree graduation. Darvish Naranbon, formerly of Cookridge, Leeds, appeared in Leeds Crown Court via video link from Rampton High Security Hospital in early 2023. During the hearing, Blaney's family members were present in the courtroom. Darvish Naranbon denied murder and pleaded guilty to manslaughter by diminished responsibility. On February the 1st of 2023, he received a mental health restriction and indefinite hospital order. Number 2. Norshad and Jajit Singh. In January of 2023, a special police unit in Delhi, India, uncovered a plot by suspected extremists to attack Hindu leaders, allegedly ordered by operators in Pakistan. The investigation began after the police found that 29-year-old Jajit Singh, also known as Jaga and Yaqub, along with Norshad, aged 54, had killed and chopped up a 21-year-old man whose body was discovered in the Balswar dairy area. The unnamed victim was reportedly addicted to illegal substances and had a tattoo of Trishul, a divine Hindu symbol, on his shoulder. Singh and Norshad had befriended the young man and brought him to their rented accommodation in Balswar dairy. They killed him and recorded a 37-second video of the murder, which they sent to a Pakistan-based handler by the name of Sohail. The latter had links to the extremist organization Lashkar-e-Toba and had allegedly tasked Singh and Norshad with killing Hindus. The duo had reportedly sent him the video to prove their allegiance. They then cut the body into 3 pieces and disposed of it in a nearby drain. Its subsequent discovery led the authorities to them, and traces of blood were found in their home. The police also recovered 2 hand grenades and 3 pistols loaded with 22 bullets. Norshad was a known associate of the extremist outfit Harkat-ul-Ansar, which operated primarily in Kashmir. He'd previously been convicted of murder and sentenced to 10 years in prison in a case under the Explosives Act. Jajit Singh was a reported member of Bambia, a notorious criminal gang. As of the latest updates on the case, the police had taken the 2 suspected killers into custody for 14 days, while further investigations were ongoing. Stay tuned after number 1 if you'd like to watch our previous release on When Strangers Go Wrong, right after this. Number 1. Travis Lewis. On September the 10th of 1996, teenager Travis Lewis broke onto a property called Snowden House, a grand 1919 family estate on Horseshoe Lake, Arkansas. He reportedly sought to rob the home and ended up fatally shooting its 75-year-old owner, Sally Snowden McKay, and her nephew, Lee Baker, a well-known Memphis guitarist. It was believed that the victims had startled Lewis as he was burglarizing one of the houses on the estate. He gunned them down before setting their bodies and parted the house on fire. Lewis spent 23 years in prison following a deal in which he pleaded guilty to the murders and robbery. During his incarceration, he was befriended by Martha McKay, Sally's daughter, with whom he started exchanging letters. Martha believed his original testimony that he had an accomplice who'd actually been the shooter and accepted that Lewis genuinely regretted the burglary. The police found no evidence of a second robber and discovered a DNA-confirmed hair of Lewis's at the scene, as well as his fingerprints inside Sally's car. A practicing Buddhist, Martha believed in forgiving him and supported his release by attending his parole hearings. Lewis was freed on parole in 2018. By then, Martha had returned to her family home and turned the property into a high-end bed and breakfast and wedding venue. she'd already employed Lewis's mother and gave him a job as well. On March the 25th of 2020, an alarm went off at the Snowden house. Upon arriving at the address, deputies saw that the back door was empty and made their way inside. They found 62-year-old Martha at the top of the stairs. She'd been stabbed and bludgeoned to death. Law enforcement chased the suspect, who jumped from a window and then entered a vehicle on the property. He tried to drive off but got stuck in the yard. The man got out of the car, fled on foot, and eventually jumped in a frigid lake but never resurfaced. Hours later, the police used sonar equipment to recover the body. It was identified as 39-year-old Travis Lewis, whom they determined had cocaine, marijuana, and meth in his system. Decades after killing Sally McKay and her nephew, he killed the former's daughter as well. The motive, like in 1996, had reportedly been to rob the home. Number 9. Kochi Salamage. At the end of the working week on September the 17th of 2021, teacher Sabina Nessa was on her way to meet a friend for a night out in South London. Their rendezvous was a pub near 28-year-old Nessa's home in Kidbrooke. The woman, who would reportedly keep to main roads after dark, was running late and decided to take a shortcut through Cater Park. 38-year-old Albanian immigrant Kochi Salamage, who'd been loitering in the park, spotted Nessa. After making sure she was alone, he struck the woman with a traffic triangle. Salamage then dragged her into a nearby bush and strangled her to death. A dog walker found Nessa's lifeless body under vegetation in the park the following day. Salamage was identified through CCTV footage and arrested on September the 26th. The fatal attack was reported to have stemmed from frustration associated with the recent breakdown of his marriage. Salamage's unnamed Romanian wife had moved out following repeated incidents of domestic violence, in at least one of which the man had put his hands around her throat. Prior to killing Nessa, Salamage had visited the hotel where his wife worked and asked her to have intimate relations with him, which she'd refused. He then took out his rage and frustration on Nessa, who by all accounts was a total stranger to him. Salamage subsequently pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment in April of 2022. Number 8. Kelly Waterson. On February the 5th of 2016, British model Gemma Hilton was waiting for a friend at Woody's Bar in Liverpool. Shortly after 1 a.m., the single mother of 3 was drunkenly hugged and kissed by 37-year-old Kelly Waterson. The latter was a complete stranger to Hilton, who consequently pushed her out of her personal space. Enraged, Waterson then threw her wine glass over the model and then pushed it in her face twice. In the attack, which was captured on CCTV, the 34-year-old model sustained severe injuries that required over 50 stitches and a 3-hour operation to mend. Hilton was left with 2 large scars on her face, one of which had resulted from a glass shard cutting deep into her cheek. Her recovery was difficult, particularly with regard to her self-confidence, which had reportedly already been affected following her separation from the father of her children. Hilton later told a media outlet that one of the most heartbreaking moments was seeing that her own children were terrified of her appearance. After she'd been released from the hospital, Waterson was handed a 6-year prison sentence at Liverpool Crown Court after pleading guilty to wounding. Number 7. Peter Nowak. Canadian woman Jamie Coots and her friend Genevieve Thomas were vacationing in Playa del Carmen, Mexico, in early December of 2021. While at the Coyote Lounge Bar, the women were approached by Peter Nowak, a professional boxer from Ontario. He was reported to have incessantly come onto them and, after being repeatedly refused, lashed out with extreme violence. He'd initially given the women the impression that he was walking away, but then ran towards them at full speed. Nowak attacked 27-year-old Coots with a barrage of punches, and he also struck Thomas, who fell to the ground and later needed stitches to her head. Following the assault, Coots was in severe condition, but knowing that surgery in Mexico would cost her tens of thousands of dollars, she pleaded with local doctors to allow her to return home. An online fundraiser set up in Coots' name quickly gathered over $20,000, and, accompanied by a paramedic, she and Thomas were flown back to Vancouver. The pilot reportedly maintained a lower altitude than normal, so as not to worsen Coots' injuries, and the women were rushed to Vancouver General Hospital after landing. While at the medical facility, the full severity of Coots' condition was revealed. The damage inflicted by the professional boxer had resulted in her nose being broken in 3 places and multiple skull fractures, one of which had left her left eyeball with virtually no support. Under the threat of losing her eye, the woman had surgery on December the 13th, when several metal plates were inserted between her nose and eye. In the aftermath, Nowak was arrested and faced charges of attempted murder and assault. Number 6. Michelle Go. On the morning of January the 15th of 2022, Michelle Go left her apartment on New York City's Upper East Side and headed towards the Times Square 42nd Street station. The 40-year-old woman waited for the R train, and at around 9:40, it was approaching the platform. Within moments, Go was pushed from behind onto the tracks and into the path of the oncoming train. The woman, who'd volunteered with New York's Junior League for over a decade, was subsequently pronounced dead at the scene. She never saw her attacker, identified as 61-year-old homeless man Marshall Simon, who had a criminal background and a history of mental illness. Shortly before killing Go, he'd harassed other commuters, including a woman who later told investigators she'd walked away from him after feeling like she was going to be pushed. Simon surrendered to the authorities and was charged with second-degree murder. In light of the incident, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority announced a pilot program that would install platform screen doors at 3 stations. The public had called for such an initiative from the MTA in the past, but it never materialized, and the pilot program at Times Square reportedly didn't include the platform where Go had died. Updates on the legal proceedings associated with Simon's charge indicated that in March of 2022, he was found unfit to stand trial, prompting the Assistant District Attorney to ask for more time to review the case. Number 5. Lauren Carrier. Lauren Carrier answered the front door of her home in the suburb of Beaverton, Portland, on March the 3rd of 2022, and was met by a man whom she didn't know. Before leaving, he asked about someone named Jasmine, but Carrier told him he'd gotten the wrong address. The same man whom the authorities would identify as 27-year-old parolee Brian Aguilera returned on the evening of the following day. Carrier was wary of his second appearance and only slightly cracked the door. Aguilera then forced his way inside and began punching the mother of one repeatedly before grabbing a 7-inch kitchen knife. Carrier was stabbed and slashed nearly a dozen times as she fought her attacker, who kept trying to push her father towards the living room. She used the baseball bat which she'd kept by the front door to defend herself before neighbors heard her screams. 2 of them chased after Aguilera and ultimately pinned him down until the authorities arrived at the scene, while other neighbors provided urgent aid to Carrier's extensive injuries. She was hospitalized with a broken rib, punctured lungs, and severed nerves in her right arm that rendered her unable to properly use the limb. Aguilera was booked into Washington County Jail on charges that included attempted murder, first-degree assault, and unlawful use of a weapon. Number 4. Mark Collier. In the summer of 2018, after watching a soccer match at a bar in the Greater Manchester area, an Englishman was knocked unconscious in an unprovoked attack. 28-year-old Mark Collier and his friend Adam Buckley were heading home when they saw a male acquaintance of theirs actively involved in a fight. The 2 men decided to keep their distance and were later joined by the other man. Then, as the latter and Buckley went up a dirt track to relieve themselves, Collier was attacked by 2 men. They'd mistakenly believed him to have been part of the previous altercation. As later recounted by Buckley, one of the men punched Collier with such force that he fell backwards in the air several feet and was already unconscious before smashing the back of his head on the pavement. By his own admission, Buckley thought his friend was dead. Collier spent 5 days in the neurological unit of Salford Royal Hospital after suffering a fractured skull and bleeding on the brain. He survived but had no recollection of the attack. His life was severely impacted by the incident, as the self-employed landscape gardener was unable to return to his work or even drive and leave the house unassisted. Number 3. Mark OBrien. In April of 2022, British man Mark OBrien was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 9 years served following the death of 83-year-old Peggy Wright. OBrien suffered from treatment-resistant paranoid schizophrenia. While under the belief that he'd been shouted at and called names, he poured petrol through the letterbox of Wright's Birmingham home on April the 18th of 2021. He lit it and fled, but was arrested later that same day. 53-year-old Andrew France, who lived at the address with Wright, woke up and saw flames coming up the stairs. He alerted his mother, and as the fire spread into her bedroom, realized they could no longer go out the front door. Franz held his mother in his arms and jumped with her to the ground below. Both sustained serious injuries in the fall, from which Wright passed away at Queen Elizabeth Hospital at around 11 p.m. Upon being taken into custody, OBrien told the authorities that his brain was fried, among other incoherent remarks, but also mentioned, "Think I got the wrong house." In the attack's aftermath, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter due to diminished responsibility, arson, being reckless as to whether life was endangered, and grievous bodily harm. All of his pleas were accepted after medical experts attested to his medical condition. He was held in a secure mental facility until being deemed fit to serve the remainder of his sentence in prison. Number 2. Sean the Val Smith. UCLA grad student Brianna Kupfer was working alone in the Croft House store on La Brea Avenue in the upscale Fairfax neighborhood of Los Angeles on January the 13th of 2022. According to the LAPD, 24-year-old Kupfer had texted a friend at around 1:36 p.m. and written that she felt uncomfortable about a person that was in the luxury furniture store. Roughly 20 minutes later, a customer walked in to find Kupfer unresponsive in a pool of her own blood. The woman had been stabbed, and by the time that the emergency services reached her, she passed away. The police recovered surveillance footage of her attacker, ultimately identified as 31-year-old Sean the Val Smith, who at the time had no fixed address. His photo was circulated by the authorities, and a $250,000 reward was offered for information, leading to his arrest and conviction. A bartender from a restaurant in Pasadena recognized Smith and alerted local authorities, who arrested him at a bus bench and subsequently turned him over to the LAPD. Smith, described as having a criminal record and a history of mental illness, was charged with murder and use of a deadly weapon. Number 1. Joseph Kelly Banks. In late March of 2022, a Portland man was charged with 3 killings that were described by the authorities as entirely random. Court documents associated with the 15-count indictment against Joseph Kelly Banks, age 49, didn't provide a motive for his spree, which had unfolded over successive months, or a justifiable connection between him and the victims. Banks was reported to have first gunned down 39-year-old Isaiah Hurst, who on January the 2nd was found dead in the driver's seat of a sedan that had crashed on the 100 block of North Morgan Street. On the afternoon of February the 2nd, on Southeast Start Street, 35-year-old Jeff Ramirez was shot dead in his pickup truck. The last victim believed to have been claimed by Banks was on North Stanton Street, where Mark Johnson, age 55, was found dead outside his SUV on March the 1st. Banks was charged with 3 counts of second-degree murder with a firearm, and his attorney entered a not guilty plea on his behalf, with his next court date set for May the 9th. Banks, a reported schizophrenia sufferer, was found not guilty by reason of insanity for the illegal possession of a firearm by a felon in 2007. For over a decade, he was in federal custody under psychiatric care, mainly at the Federal Medical Center in North Carolina. A judge eventually determined that his condition had improved and could be medically controlled, and Banks was released to a halfway house in 2021. Thanks for watching. Would you rather make no new friends for the rest of your life, or never try new food again? Let us know in the comments section below.